Before we delve headfirst into rabbinic Judaism, what it is and why it's important to know where it's coming from, I must share with you guys a find that was found this week, or was announced this week, that's so big, it may be, if not one of the most important finds of our lifetime in terms of biblical history and the validity of the Torah. We know from previous classes that we know the Torah is real, because if you go back in archaeology, you would be able to actually get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's 2,000 years ago. If you remember from my previous class, the Jews got the Torah 3,333 years ago. A very, very interesting number. You're going to have to wait another 1,111 years for those numbers to line up again. This is a very interesting year, 3333. Now, the oldest complete Torahs that we have are 2,000 years old. Now, biblical critics, and anyone can be a critic, a biblical critic says, well, maybe somebody wrote the Torah much later on in history. It actually was not given 3,333 years ago. Really was given, let's say, 2,000 years ago. And somebody invented a backstory to the Jews. And our backstory includes Egypt, and includes getting the Torah Mount Sinai and coming into Israel. All that took place within a very tight 40-year period. And then when we went into Israel, we took over the land, 400 or 500 years. We built the first temple. Babylonians destroyed it, 70 years. We built the second temple. But a lot of that could have been a backstory invented by someone. Okay, and that would make sense. So then we went through some of the archaeology saying, no, you can go back way more than 2,000 years. There are actually psukim, which means verses from the Torah, not complete Torahs, but straight up verses that have been found from First Temple period. There have been outside verification from other nations that mention stories that are told in the Torah. Even the 10 plagues, which go all the way back to the actual story of Exodus, have been found in the Egyptians' own words in the Ipuwer papyrus. But Torah itself, the biblical critics, they're like, okay, but how do we know? How do we know? So what was this week? This week literally put biblical critics to sleep. And when I say to sleep, I don't mean to sleep. I mean to sleep with the fishies, as they say in Mafia, right? To sleep with the fishes. They're done. What was found? So this is big. When the Jewish people left Egypt, before they went into Israel, and that was that Exodus period, very tight period, when the Jewish people left Egypt, given the Torah, before they went into Israel, they were put between two mountains. And the names of the mountains were Gerizim and Aval. Gerizim and Aval. Half of the Levium went on one mountain and half went on the other. The Jewish people were between the mountains. And Moshe gave what's called the blessings and the curses if one listens to Torah versus one ignores and rejects Torah. And it's a very, very interesting, in the Torah itself, there's a curse for committing adultery. There's a curse for taking a bribe as a judge. Like there are curses like you got to be moral. You're about to go into Canaan. There's a lot of wicked people there. You can't be influenced by them. And interestingly enough, Gerizim, where the blessings were given, that mountain, the Talmud says, it bloomed and it blossomed. There were flowers, just like you would expect. It became a blessed mountain. And the mountain right next to it became a cursed mountain. And even though they share the identical topography, the same climate, one of the mountains are still full of bloom and flowers, and one of them is completely and utterly desolate and barren. The Jewish people, when they stood listening to the curses and the blessings, so the curses and blessings were written on stones so that they should be enshrined. And there were sacrifices that were brought at that time to animals that were not indigenous to that area. They've done digs between Gerizim and Aval, and they found hundreds of the animal bones as spoken about the Torah to animals that were not indigenous to that area, but that were brought over from Egypt. They found the sacrifice bones. So that's already pretty awesome. What do they find this week that changed the rules of the game? They found the stone with the curses. They literally found, as quoted in the Torah, the stones with the curses, including God's name, including written in biblical Hebrew, the way biblical Hebrew is pronounced. At the very least, and it's dated at least 3,200 years ago. Now, according to the Torah, it would be more approximately 3,290. Dated correctly, writing, and biblical critics said it couldn't be that Torah was written so early because people didn't know how to write, especially not sophisticated Hebrew. Now it turns out that the one who wrote it not only knew how to write biblical Hebrew, but apparently there was a leadership involved. He was very intelligent. That's what the archaeologists say, based on the way it was written. It was written poetically and so on. So this is a very, 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 very big story. It's something that tells us, you know what? We can literally go back to the time of national revelation. Okay, so I put that out there. I think it's important. I hope you can appreciate the significance of such a find. This is many hundreds of years earlier than the earliest found that was ever found. And it had curses, and it says the word curses. On the mountain, the curses were given before they ever went into Israel after they left Egypt. That's like that's huge. Okay. Now, biblical rabbinic Judaism. Now, I want to speak with you, not give you a lecture, but rather to have the questions well up from inside of you so that you really want to know the answer. Ben Franklin, a great American hero, used to say, there's nothing more insignificant in the world than the answer to a question that wasn't asked. And by the way, in Hebrew, that's called bikush. Bikush means a desire, a yearning to understand. So let's yearn for a little bit. Shall we? Let's yearn. I'm a Jew. I'm living in New York. I'm not from New York. I'm from Cleveland. Lived in Israel for 4 years. Lived in LA, lived in Jersey. Back in New York over here. And I've got 11 children. And I'm bringing my children up through the eyes of Torah. And Torah is a big value to us. Now, there are other values to us as well. Making an honest living, valuable. Amazing character, huge. Being grateful, all these things that would really do tie into Torah. But one of the core values that we have, or if you want to use a sociological term, my organizing factor is Torah. It's what organizes my other interests, my other desires, my other pursuits. We all have organizing factors in our life. For some people, it's money. That organizes their life. Everything they do is in order to make a living, to save money. For some people, their organizing factor is sports. From season to season, player to player, when they're doing nothing, they're watching sports. This is their life. For some people, their organizing factor is food. They live from breakfast to lunch, lunch to supper. Food gives them that joy that gives their life meaning and organization. In my life, my organizing factor is Torah. They're the glasses that I use to see everything else with. Now, people call I'm a foodie, I'm a glutton. I'm a foodie. I do like food. I enjoy sports. I know the news. I love music and so on. But none of those organize my life. Torah does. And through the eyes of Torah, I become more humble, I become more grateful, I become more kind, I could vanquish the dragon inside of me that comes out when it's not supposed to. You know what I'm saying? That is my organizing factor. Now, when I live a life of Torah, what does that mean? Now, Torah is a very finite book. I'm looking around if I can grab a little Torah. Here's a Torah. Let me show you. Torah. Behold, Torah. This is Torah. Behold, Torah. Is everything that I do in this book? Yes and no. Lots of what I do is not written in the book. A lot of what I do is extrapolated from the book. And the extrapolation gives me guidance how to do what I need to do in this world. To the point that if I just use Torah, I would not know how to be a Jew. I wouldn't know. And therefore, there is a concept called oral law. An oral law is not written in the Torah, although if you look in the Torah, you'll see commentaries that could be some of the oral law. But oral law is not the basic words of the Torah. Oral law was given to us the same time that the Torah was given to us by Moshe. Oral law was the expanded version. And without oral law, I literally cannot be a Jew. I can't. For example, let me ask you a question. What do you do on Yom Kippur? You fast. Does the Torah say fast? So I'll tell you, the Torah doesn't say to fast. You know what the Torah says? The Torah says, you should afflict yourself. What's called afflict? Maybe affliction means I should step on thumbtacks. Maybe affliction means I should be forced to watch 24 hours of Friends straight. I like Friends, but not 24 hours of it, right? What does it mean to be afflicted? How do I know affliction means fasting? That's oral law. There's literally not a single law in the Torah that you could fulfill without oral law. Even don't kill. That's straight up, isn't it? Or is it? What about war? If I transgress, don't kill. What if it's a war for defense? What if it's not for defense, but it's to expand territory? What if somebody should get the death penalty? What if I'm a doctor and I'm performing risky surgery? I mean, there's so many scenarios. Don't kill doesn't do it for me. There's not one law in the Torah that you can fulfill without oral law. So here is the best way to picture it, just in a sort of logistical way. Moshe comes down from Mount Sinai, gives the 10 commandments. Are they commandments? They are not. They are mission statements. They are mission statements. That's why they're not called in Hebrew the Aseret HaMitzvot, the 10 commandments. They're called the Aseret HaDvarim, the 10 statements. People start calling them the 10 commandments because of the movie. Okay, now you know. There are actually 12 commandments in the 10 mission statements, by the way. But that's just very basic things. But within the Torah itself, there are 613 commandments, a lot of commandments. Now, most of them don't apply to you or to me. You got to be a Kohen. They have to be a temple. There's a lot of commandments that are time specific or location specific or scenario specific. But there are certainly more than 10. That's certainly so. So, when did Moshe give these 613 commandments? The answer is when they were in the desert. When were they in the desert? Well, they left Egypt. They got the Torah at Mount Sinai. There was this horrific story about spies where the Jews wanted to send spies to spy out the land of Israel, God said, just go to Israel. I got you. I just took care of the Egyptians. I'm going to take care of the Canaanites as well. And the Jews said, nah, we want to see it. We want to spy. And when they came, they got all frightened. And they came back and they said, oh no, Chicken Little, the sky's falling in. We're never going to be able to beat all the Canaanites. And they cried and they cried. And God says, you know what? You are a nation that has not learned to trust me. And because you haven't learned to trust me, I can't let you be the people who begin a new nation in Israel. So you are going to stay in the desert, and your children, they are going to come to Israel with me. And that generation died out in the desert. Now, were they starving? Nay. Why weren't they starving? Because they had manna. They had what to eat. They had what to drink. There's something called the Be'er of Miriam, the well of Miriam that followed them around. They miraculously survived. Question, what do they do in those 40 years? What do they do? There was no Netflix. There was no YouTube. There was no Spotify. There's no TikTok. Like, what did they do for 40 years? And the answer is they studied Torah. They had an awesome teacher. The teacher's name was Moses. They actually had the opportunity each day to study with Moses. And it was such a big deal that although they didn't come into Israel, they were known as the Dor Deah, the generation of knowledge. Because when you have a chance to study with Moses, there's no professor that trumps that. That's big. So what do they study with him? And the answer is as follows. Moses would say, okay, God says, you should put something on your hand and between your eyes. Well, what is that, by the way? Tefillin, right? Put on tefillin. And it's one verse in the Torah. It says it twice. It should be a sign upon your hand. And a totafos, which we're not even sure what it means. It means tatpas. Tatpas means a 2 plus 2 between your eyes. A sign on your hand and a 2 plus 2 between your eyes. What does that mean? So, you know what it means? They went to Moshe and they said, okay, Moshe, we got it. Sign on my hand. What am I supposed to make a tattoo of Magen David on my palm? That's a sign on my hands, right? Maybe put the letter Chai and a Chamsa, right? Why can't it mean that? The Torah doesn't say. The Torah just says a sign on your hands. So Moshe, who had this dialogue with the Almighty, explained, no, it doesn't mean tattoos. We don't allow tattoos. It's a box. What does a box have to be made of? What does it have inside of it? How is it put on? All of that is oral law. All of it. Now, that oral law was given at the same time. That's the 40 years. The 40 years was hashing out the details. So by the time they left to Israel, they knew what they were supposed to be doing. How many of you have ever celebrated the holiday of Sukkot? Raise a hand. Sukkot. Yeah? Okay. Did you ever shake something on Sukkot? Maybe a Chabad guy gave you a Chabad, you shook something? What was the fruit? It does have a name called a citron. I think somewhere in Europe they named the car after it. Citron with the 2 little dots on top. You'll see them in Israel sometimes. Right? It's citron. Does the Torah say to take a citron? Does the Torah say, hey, take an esrog? Nay. You know what the Torah says? The Torah says, and you should take for yourself, pre-Eitz Hadar, a beautiful fruit. What is that supposed to mean? What's a beautiful fruit? Is a beautiful fruit? Maybe it's a pineapple with that like waterfall spritz coming out the top, right? That's not nice, right? Or maybe it's a star fruit, like a nice shiny star fruit. Very underrated, a good, nice, tart and sweet, good texture. Maybe it's a star fruit. How do I know it's a citron? Oral law. Oral law. So what am I proving over here? What I'm proving is that number one, you cannot do anything Jewish without oral law. Number two, even those in history who said, oh, I only believe in the written law, not the oral law, baloney. Everything you do is oral law. Otherwise, your Judaism would look like baseball. It would look something totally different. There's not a single law in the Torah that you could do without oral law. Not a single one, literally. How do I marry a lady? This is the case to be made for oral law. Now, let's make the case a little bit stronger. How do I know that oral law hasn't changed? Again, God is giving to Moshe the basics. Moshe speaks to God and says, okay, what does tefillin look like? Are the straps? What's written inside of them? What do we shake on Sukkos? What do I cut for bris milah, for circumcision? Okay, but that's oral. How do I know it didn't change over time? Remember, and I didn't mention this, but it's important to know, oral law was supposed to be given over orally. That's why it's called oral law. There's a reason that oral law is not found in here. There's a number of reasons why, but I'll give you at least one of them. I'll give you a few. When you have everything in a book, you know what happens to that book? It gets put on the bookshelf and you never see it again. Part of the idea of oral law is that Judaism should remain relevant and dynamic. You want Judaism to be dynamic. And if oral law becomes written law, then it is not dynamic. And if it's not dynamic, then it dies a quiet death. How many of us have bought books or downloaded programs and we just never use it? But we have it, but we never use it. The idea of oral law is to have to give it over from teacher to student, teacher to student. There's another reason. Listen carefully. When we have a teacher and the teacher transmits oral law, I don't just hear the law from the teacher, but I also get the opportunity to witness the teacher in action. If I need to have what's called a Rebbe, and I don't mean the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the word Rebbe means teacher in general. When I have the ability to create a Rebbe for myself, then I can look at them. I can watch them. I can see how they treat their wife, how she treats her husband, how they treat their kids, how they treat their friends. I learn from a living example. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal because if I don't see it in action, then it's just good ideas that eventually die. So that's another reason that oral law was supposed to remain oral. See, here's how to picture it. If I'm a professor and I'm giving a long lecture, are you going to write down word for word everything that I say? Not unless you're a speed typist, right? What are you going to do? You'll write down the bullet points. The bullet points, okay? He covered this, he covered that, he covered that. And then when you look at the bullet points, hopefully it'll remind you of the lecture. You're not writing down word. I once tried to do that. I once actually got a recording and I tried to write down word for word. It was forever because a person, I know I'm in the middle of a book right now, so I dictate what I want to say. And when I dictate for about 14 minutes, that's about 20 pages worth. So if I did for an hour, I mean, if you speak quickly, how many words can a person speak a minute? Between 200 and 300 words a minute, right? That's how many I'm speaking now. If I was speaking one word a second, it would sound like I am speaking, well, and that would be 60 words. So to write down word for word a lecture, you wouldn't do. You'd write down the bullet points, and those bullet points would remind you of the lecture. The bullet points are this. This is the bullet points. There was an entire lecture that is covered by every one of these lines. Understand? These are the cliff notes. Here, there's a concept called tefillin. Now the lecture explains what tefillin is. The lecture is the oral law, and the bullet points are the written law. That's why everything is written very, very, very briefly. Otherwise, you would never finish the Torah. Forget about Simchas Torah once a year. So there have to be an oral law that accompanies this written law. And we know that there was an oral law that accompanied it, not just because, hey, I couldn't do anything otherwise, but the Torah itself, listen carefully, the Torah alludes to the fact that there was an entire class that was given for each line. Shall I tell you where? I'll give you an example. The Torah is speaking about bringing a certain korban, bringing a certain sacrifice. And these are the words. It says, v'zavachtem, and you should slaughter it, ka'asher tzivisicha, in the manner, according to the laws that I commanded you. However, the Torah never says how to slaughter. The Torah says, slaughter it using the prescribed methods that I explained to you, but the Torah never says how. So clearly there was a whole class about slaughtering, and the Torah says, do it like the way I showed you, like the way I explained to you. So that's oral law. So somebody who says, I don't do oral law, I don't keep oral law, well then you don't keep any of it, because without oral law, written law is practically meaningless, practically. Let me make two more arguments, and then I'll show you how it was transmitted. Another argument is like this. The Torah, for doing certain things, threatens punishment. Now, threaten sounds very threatening, but the Torah was a set of laws for civil society. And just like in our society, when you transgress certain things, you could be thrown in jail, or you could be fined, or you can be sued. The Torah threatens certain things if you do certain things, except that the laws that the Torah give are very vague, but the punishments are very often very clear. So for example, the Torah says, don't do work on Shabbat, but it doesn't explain what work is. It doesn't say what work is. Is work lifting a piano? That's work. Or a heavy table? Am I allowed to lift a heavy table on Shabbat? Or is that called work? You know the answer is, I can lift a heavy table. That's not called work. I can. And yet, turning on a light on Shabbat is called work. So what makes one thing work and not the other? And the Torah gives a clear penalty for a vague law. So if the laws wouldn't have been hashed out when they were given, then it makes no sense to give a clear penalty for a vague law. That's a little more of an intellectual argument, but you understand where I'm coming from here? One last argument. So in Hebrew, there are no vowels. There are no vowel letters. Instead of having letters that are vowels, like A-E-I-O-U, maybe Y, instead of vowel letters, there are vowel symbols. The vowel symbols, right? So what are the sounds of some of the vowel symbols? O, A, E, E. There's lots of vowel symbols. Now, in the Torah, when you look in the Torah, do you see any vowel symbols? Nothing. You don't see periods, you don't see question marks, all those are much later inventions. There's no vowels. The vowels were given over via oral law. Meaning, the oral transmission told us what vowel should be under what letter. And that's part of oral law, is to know what vowels. Why is that important? Well, when you change the vowels around, the word becomes different. For example, you know we don't eat a cheeseburger according to the Torah because it's meat and milk. So if you look in the Torah, it says, Lo svashel gedi, don't cook a kid, b'chalev imo. What does the word chalev? So what does the word chalav mean in Hebrew? Chalav means milk, except chalav has the vowels under it that makes the sound o, chalav. But because there are no vowels, there is a totally different way of reading it. Instead of don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, maybe the vowels under it are chalev. And what does the word chalev mean? The word chalev means the fats, like an animal has animal fat. that stuff you're not supposed to swallow because it gives you a lot of cholesterol, right? Maybe the Torah says, don't cook a kid in its mother's fat. How do I know that the vowels under it are chalav, milk, and not chalev, which means fat? That's oral law. Again, you cannot move without oral law. Okay, now here comes the big question. Okay, when was oral law written down? We know today oral law is written down. What is it called? It's called Talmud. Talmud is oral law that's been written down. Talmud has in it Mishnah, and Mishnah was already codified 2,000 years ago, which means that oral law remained oral for 1,300 years. And then a great rabbi named Rabbi Judah the Prince, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, began writing down Mishnah, which is the shorter version. And then a few hundred years later, Talmud was written. So they expanded on it. So why was oral law eventually written down? Today, oral law is written down. Why is it written down? And the answer is because the Jewish people were exiled. And the Babylonians came, later on the Romans came, and already during the period of the Roman persecution, Jews were not allowed to study Torah. They were already in different countries. The wisdom, the knowledge had begun to disappear. So people did not know, or they didn't have the transmission from rabbi to student. It's hard during wartime, right? During wartime to have a rabbi. And Rabbi Judah the Prince said, you know what? The Jewish people used to all be concentrated in Israel. We had our rabbis, so you could do it orally. But now that we're being spread all over, there were many Jews who moved to Egypt. Egypt had a huge, huge Jewish population. There were Jews who moved to Persia. There were Jews in Babylon. There were Jews everywhere. And there wasn't always great rabbis for them to learn oral law from. So he said, we have to write this down. It's gonna be forgotten unless we do. And therefore today, oral law is no longer oral, it's all in writing. But here's the question. If for 1,300 years it was oral, how do I know that things didn't get messed up along the way? How do I know when something's oral? Anyone here ever play the game telephone? I grew up in Cleveland, we called it broken telephone, but I know in New York they just call it telephone. And a telephone, if you ever play it, how likely is it that at the end of the line, by the time you get around the room, that the word or the phrase is the same as it was when it started? When I played, it was never. As a matter of fact, every single person changed it, and everyone thought they were the clever one to change it, except for the next person also changed it, so no one even heard your cleverness. But even 5%, it changes over time. And here's the question. How do I know that oral law, which we all use to practice Judaism, is not like the game of telephone where things eventually evolve and change and get changed? I want to differentiate between oral law and the game of telephone. And this is really an important exercise that we're going to do. I want to show you why oral law is different than the game of telephone. Okay, number one, the game of telephone is played where? Where do you play the game of telephone? Party maybe, right? Some sort of somewhere where you're having fun. Usually not a serious academic environment, correct? Game of telephone is played at a party. When Torah is studied, are you studying it at a party? You could, but Torah is usually studied in a very rigorous academic environment. So the whole circumstance is very different than the game of telephone. Okay, next. In the game of telephone, how many people tell it to how many people at one shot, at one time? So it's 1-to-1. So how many people do you need to mess up in order for the message to change? Well, you need one person to mess up, one person saying it, and then, so if that guy didn't hear it correctly, okay. In Torah, how many people transmitted to how many people? And the answer is millions to millions, right? Everyone here has been transmitted the Torah, even the oral law, even if you didn't know it was the oral law. You knew that tefillin are a black box with straps. You knew how matzah looks. You knew that you fast on Yom Kippur. That's oral law. You happen to know a ton of oral law, you just don't even realize it. Why? Because it's been passed on millions to millions. And you know what the advantage of millions to millions are? The advantage is that if a few people forget certain laws, you have enough people that remember it that they can create their automatic correction. Got that? 1 to 1, you don't have that. Another difference between the game of telephone and the transmission of oral law. When you tell it to the other person, how do you tell it to them? Do you say it loudly? You whisper, because otherwise the whole room would hear you. Be no point. Now, here's a little thing to know. When you whisper something, you can miss certain consonants. Now, it's hard to hear a whisper, especially in a party. When things are said loudly, it makes a big difference. Not only that, but in the game of telephone, let's say the person said something, but I'm not sure if I heard it. So I think some people play with something called operator, where you could ask one time. And then if you miss it, that's it, one time. Torah, are you allowed to ask if you're not sure? Again and again and again and again. It says simple Torah is supposed to be reviewed a minimum of 101 times. Again and again and again. And not only do we do it, but we practice it. You don't practice things in the game of telephone. It's just a phrase. We don't just say, oh, bris milah means circumcision of the foreskin. We actually do it. These are mitzvot that are not just cerebral, not just academic, but they're put into practice. That's another difference. You see how they're very different things. They may sound oral. And then here, in my opinion, is the biggest difference. I once had a group of students, we were in Israel, and I said, let's play a game of telephone. And we played the game of telephone, and of course, by the end, it was completely changed from what it was in the beginning. But then I said, okay, now we're gonna play it again, but if you get the message right, by the end of the line of 25 people or so, if you get it right, each of you get $20. And I'm serious, I put my money where my mouth is. $20 if you get the verse right, the line right. Guess if they got it right at the end of the line. Yeah, they did. You know why? Because they made sure to say it carefully. They made sure to enunciate, because $20 is on the line. So all it took was something to be on the line for them to be vigilant about the accuracy of the statement. All it took was $20. In Judaism, our Torah is not a game. The stakes are far higher than $20. Understand? The stakes are huge, and getting it right is paramount. And because it's so important to get it right, we make sure to say it, to repeat it, to learn from a teacher, to scream it out loud, to review it, to double and triple and quadruple check it. Because what's on the line is being in concert, in sync with God's desire. That's much more than $20. That's life itself. And therefore, oral law has remained with tremendous integrity. Now, what does archaeology teach us about oral law? Well, everything that we have found until now, even from things thousands of years old, even from items that were before oral law was ever written down, have corroborated that oral laws remained intact. For example, tefillin. If you went back in time 3,000 years, you think the Jews would say, what do you have on your head? Or would they say, yeah, tefillin? And the answer is the second thing. Yeah, tefillin. You know where they found tefillin? In the Qumran. And the Qumran is before the destruction of the Second Temple, when oral law was not yet written down. And yes, the tefillin had straps, it had compartments, there was no question, a sign on a hand. You could go to the shrine of the book where the Dead Sea Scrolls are today and look at a pair of tefillin that are more than 2,000 years old. Now, it's true, in the heat of the desert, they've shrunk, but they're still easily discernible as 4 compartments with straps, just like ours today. That's crazy. If you go anywhere in the world on Sukkot, even in places where oral law or scholarship didn't spread so widely as it did over here, and if you see what they're shaking, there's nowhere in the world ever where they've shook anything but an esrog. Always esrog. Although the Torah doesn't say citron, it's always been, no matter where in the world you go. Even Jews that have not seen each other for thousands of years. Because, when the Jews were dispersed, you had some Jews go to Africa, and some Jews went to Asia, and some Jews, they were really, really spread out. And there was no way for them to have a connection with each other. Sometimes, no trains or cars, and yet the same thing. Same circumcision, there's never a question, even though the Torah doesn't say where to cut. So what I'm giving you right now is the validity of oral law as strong as you picture the written law is. That's how strong oral law is. It was a really, really cool story. You can Google it and find it. I found it, I've shown it to my students. It's a cool story when they were uncovering Masada. You go to Masada, and when they uncovered Masada, and they've uncovered Masada in stages, but when they really put their efforts into it after the Jewish people, I think it was after 67 is when they really began putting their efforts into it, they discovered a mikvah. Mikvah is that body of water that you go into at certain times to purify yourself. It's called mikvah. Every community has a mikvah. A mikvah is more important than a synagogue. If you have money for a synagogue or a mikvah, you build a mikvah. Mikvah is a big deal. Now, the laws of mikvah are very, very technical. It's very hard to build a proper mikvah. There are experts in mikvah, and the reason why it's so technical is because there are certain sizes that it has to be. There's a certain way that the water has to enter the mikvah, and all of those details are oral law. Now, when Masada was discovered, and the word got out that a mikvah was found in Masada, people were genuinely excited. Like, are you kidding? There's a mikvah in Masada? I wonder if it will hold up the veracity, the accuracy of oral law. Meaning, since the mikvah was built before oral law was written down, so it relied on the oral transmission to build it. Let's go have a look at the mikvah and see whether oral law has stood the test of time. Are our mikvahs today the same as the mikvah Masada? And this was such a big deal that the Jerusalem Post sent a reporter up. There were 2 great rabbis who, in order to honor the moment, they were elderly gentlemen. They climbed the Masada together with other reporters, wearing their black hats. They were, very religious people, black hats, beards, or black coats. To them, it was like Shabbat. This is going to prove oral law has remained intact or not. So they told the reporters, if oral law is intact, then this is what we expect to find. And the reporter who wrote this, you have to go back, but I did find it online once, so it's It's a beautiful article. The reporter writes about the sense of mission, the moment of holiness, when they're going to see whether the mikvah masada corroborates oral law or disproves oral law. And they went into the mikvah. Of course, mikvah is bare, there's no water in it for many years. They took out their tape measures, and there were the silence as everyone is waiting to see. And then when they finished, the rabbis look up, showed the numbers, and they said the following words: kosher lemahadrin. It is kosher according to the best mikvah of today. It was huge. It corroborated oral law. It was a great time of joy and happiness for all those Jews that want to know that, is Judaism in the age of Instagram, in the age of Facebook, is Judaism today the same as it was in the times of Romans, before Jesus, before King David? Judaism going all the way back to Mount Sinai. And everything that we have seen has corroborated that. It's very, very exciting stuff. And that is oral law. I'm going to finish with the following. People mistake rabbinic Judaism for oral law. They think that, there's the written law, that's the Torah, and everything else is the rabbis. Incorrect. Oral law is not rabbinic. Oral law is what we call minat Torah. It is biblical. It is, people look at it as rabbinic because it's written in the Talmud, which also has some rabbinical decrees in it. But the Talmud does a lot of things. And one of the things it does is it expands on oral law. But oral law would not technically be called rabbinic law. I remember once we were listening to a speaker called Dennis Prager. He's a speaker in California. Didn't really make it over here to the East Coast, but I knew him. His son used to eat by me on Shabbat, and I like him. I like what he has to say. When he comes to speak about Judaism, that's where I disagree with him. He sort of disagrees with himself because although he himself is not Shabbat observant, he sent his kid to a Haredi yeshiva called Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, Ner Israel, which is actually a very religious. So somewhere in his heart, he got where that his son should be getting the entirety of the set of laws. But he got up to speak in UCLA, and one of my students was the Hillel president, so she arranged it, and I went to hear him speak. And it was all great. He was speaking about Israel. He was very pro-Israel, of course, and I liked a lot of what he had to say. But there was a QA afterwards, and then it started speaking about Judaism, and it got into rabbinic law. And that's where I knew, okay, no, I'm not going to like what he's going to say because I know he doesn't have the background. And essentially, someone asked him, do you keep Judaism? He goes, well, I keep the written law, but the rabbinic Judaism, not so much because maybe the rabbis this, that. So I had a fellow rabbi that I was training in, but it was very learned. It was a younger guy. He had a baby face, so I used to call him the baby face assassin because he really knew his stuff. But you'd look at him and he would look not so powerful. But he got up very innocently. He said, when you say rabbinic law, do you mean oral law? Do you mean gezerot? Do you mean takanot? Do you mean Torah Shebaal Peh? Do you mean minagim? And Dennis Perry looks at him and says, what are those? He goes, there's 5 major categories, and every category has a different way that it evolved. Every category has a different gravitas. You can't just say rabbinic law. Right? That's like saying, I don't believe in medicine. What? I don't believe in vaccination. Really? Which vaccination? Do you? Don't you? Just a blanket statement? Oral law would be at the highest level. That is biblical. Rabbinic mitzvot are very few and far between. There are a total of 7 rabbinic commandments. And by the way, you do all of them anyways. Even somebody who says, oh, I don't believe in rabbinic law. I remember there was a Reform rabbi. I used to be a rabbi in New Jersey, and this Reform rabbi who lived in the same town as me, he said, oh, we don't do rabbinic law. And then the following, it was a few weeks later, and it was Hanukkah, and I had a picture of him lighting the menorah. And I wrote them a letter. By the way, menorah is one of the 7 rabbinic commandments. So you're actually doing it, you just don't even realize it. And then also it was on Purim, and the newspaper, it was like one of these local newspapers for our area in New Jersey, and it had him reading the Megillah, rollerblading around his temple, dressed like Elvis. I'm sure it was fun, but I said, but reading Megillah, that's one of the 7 rabbinic laws. So it's very interesting that a lot of times people think like, oh, I believe, but you're really doing it. You don't even realize that's what it is. A normative Judaism includes all this stuff. That is the foundation of what makes us Jewish. Now, as it happens, there is such a thing called decrees, where a rabbi or a group of rabbis would present different decrees to safeguard a law from being broken. And we're going to get a little more into that next week when we get into mitzvot. Thank you very much